Hello? Hello? There we go. Good evening. Welcome to Calvary Baptist Church. Would you please stand with me as we worship? You hear me when I call. You are my morning song. Though darkness fills the night, it cannot hide the light. Whom shall I fear? You crush the enemy underneath my feet. You are my sword and shield, though troubles linger still. Whom shall I fear? I know who goes before me. I know who stands behind. The God of angel armies is always by my side. The one who reigns forever, he is a friend of mine. The God of angel armies is always by my side. My strength is in your name, for you alone can save. You will deliver me. Yours is the victory. Whom shall I fear? Whom shall I fear? I know who goes before me. I know who stands behind. The God of angel armies is always by my side. The one who reigns forever, he is a friend of mine. The God of angel armies is always by my side. And nothing formed against me shall stand. You hold the whole world in your hands. I'm holding on to your promises. You are faithful. You are faithful. You are faithful. I know who goes before me. I know who stands behind. The God of angel armies is always by my side. The one who reigns forever, he is a friend of mine. The God of angel armies is always by my side. The God of angel armies is always by my side. Thank you. You may be seated.
Good evening. If you would, turn in your Bibles to Zachariah 14. Zechariah 14 is where we're going to finish up our whole series that we've been on for, I don't even remember when we started. It's been a few months anyway. And kind of a lot happens here, so we'll have to go kind of quick. I do want to give a little disclaimer. Next week, we're going to start a series in the Sermon on the Mount, and I'm going to really try to make an effort to do a lot smaller chunks so that so we have more time for prayer. So I've kind of struggled in this book to keep the Bible part of it down to half an hour or less. So it's a lot to cram in. So the Sermon on the Mount lends itself a little better to going in little bite-sized pieces. So if you've been frustrated that we don't have enough prayer time, we're going to try to fix that. So in Zechariah, right, this whole book, it's been awesome because it is so Christ-centered, and as Zechariah wants to preach to his people that are returning to their land, they've been stalled on rebuilding the temple, and Haggai preached about that, and they kind of get started again, but they're discouraged. They're discouraged on their progress, and they don't have an army yet, and they're so exposed and they're so weak. And Zachariah comes along, and God gives him all these visions and these words from the Lord to comfort his people and to encourage them and to tell them that he hasn't forgot about Israel. He has a plan for Israel. And so Zechariah takes us from that spot all the way up through, you saw the last few weeks, we see the return of Christ and the salvation of Israel. And tonight we're going to see all the way up to the kingdom. We're going to see the Battle of Armageddon, and the Lord establishes his kingdom. And I think, just kind of by way of reminder, it just makes the most sense to take these scriptures just as kind of as literally as you can. Obviously, there's figures of speech. Sometimes in apocalyptic literature, there's imagery and things. And so we understand everything in its context. We understand that sometimes the Lord uses figures of speech and images and symbols. But behind all that is a literal truth. And that's what we want to get at. And I know, there's one thing I want to share with you. So, Martin Luther, right? So, the man who sparked the Reformation, and, far smarter than me, I stand on his shoulders. But he approached Zechariah as this figurative, symbolic, spiritual, spiritualize everything in the book. And by the time he gets to the end and he gets to chapter 14, with this kind of figurative approach, in his commentary on Zechariah, he says, "I surrender, for I am not certain of what the prophet speaks." I give up. I don't know what he's saying. Well, I think if you just take it plainly as what it says, I don't think it's hard to figure out what he's saying, and so we're gonna get to that. Israel, they look up, they see the Lord return, they turn to the Lord. They see the one that they've pierced, and they repent and they believe. Before all that happens, Israel is going to make a covenant with a false Messiah, with an anti-shepherd, with the anti-Christ. And they're going to make this covenant in the middle of that 7-year covenant. The Antichrist is going to break the covenant with Israel. He's going to require that they worship him. The people of Israel will refuse. The Antichrist will gather armies from all over the world to march against Israel to exterminate the Jews. And that's going to lead us to this kind of great siege on Jerusalem. The Bible calls this the Battle of Armageddon. And so that's where chapter 14 begins, at this siege. We've talked about the repentance of Israel. We talked last week about the cleansing of Israel. It's going to kind of take a step back, though, but before that happens, and kind of take a closer look at the Battle of Armageddon. Verse 1. "Behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you will be divided among you." Okay, so again, a day is coming. A day is coming for the Lord, the day of the Lord. Not a single day, but a period of time. A term for when God is going to bring about his wrath on sinners and on sin and establish his own righteousness on the earth. The day of the Lord is a time that covers from the rapture, I believe, through the kingdom. So we talked a while back. Remember, there's going to be, Daniel tells us, Revelation tells us, there's 4 armies that are going to be coming against Israel from every direction, right? From the north, Ezekiel talks about Russia and some of her Arab allies are marching against Israel. From the south is Egypt, Daniel tells us. From the west, Daniel chapter 2, chapter 7, Revelation 17 describes this kind of 10-nation European confederacy, a revived Roman Empire from the west. From the east, 200 million soldiers from the area of China. So Israel is surrounded. And it seems like with all the armies of the world coming against this tiny little nation, it seems like their victory is certain. It seems like they've already won the day. Verse 2, "For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, and houses plundered, the women ravished, and half of the city exiled. But the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city." Okay, first thing I want you to notice, though, all these nations gather against Israel. Who gathers them? God does. Yeah. So the Lord is sovereign over all things, right? He's in control. Nothing escapes his notice. It's not like, oops, armies against Israel. Wow, that caught me by surprise. No, God gathers them. God orchestrates them. And you say, well, wait, but this is God's people. God is bringing armies against God. Has this whole book been about how the Lord is going to protect his people? Well, yes, but the Lord often uses pagan nations to execute judgment for a couple reasons. Okay, often to purge God's people. So God has used Babylon to do that in Israel's history. He's used many of Israel's enemies to purge out rebels from among his people, to cause his people to return to him. And so here at this last moment, this is a chance for people to be motivated isn't the word I want, but motivated to see the Lord, to return the Lord, to trust the Lord. Okay? They've trusted in the Antichrist, and that was a horrible failure. And now, who should they trust in? And so God is using pagan nations to return the hearts of his people to himself. He also often uses pagan nations as a form of judgment upon themselves. So these nations, he gathers them. They're going to march against his people, and then he's going to execute judgment on them. Okay? We call this the Battle of Armageddon because that's what Revelation 16 refers to it as. And so all these people, all these different armies gather on the plains of Megiddo. It's a large, big, flat swath of land, and it's going to extend into Jerusalem. And so this battle is going to be across Megiddo and into Jerusalem. Jeremiah 30 refers to this as the time of Jacob's trouble. And this is probably the greatest time of Jacob. There's never been a time when Jacob, Israel, God's people, the Jews, will be in a situation like this. Okay? And it's going to describe, so what happens here? Well, one, it says the city is taken. The city is overrun. And then it says their houses will be plundered. Okay? Then it says that the women will be taken advantage of. And then it says that half of the city is going to be taken as prisoners or killed. And so it looks very bleak. This is doom and gloom. Everything that Israel dreads is coming about, and it's hopeless. It looks hopeless. What will God do? Verse 3, here's what God will do. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. You could have a lot of enemies. There's a lot of different people that could be your opponent, and maybe you'll win and maybe you'll lose. Okay? If God is your opponent, what? You lose. You always lose. Okay? Why? Because the Lord always wins. And it says, and he's going to fight against these nations as when he fights on a day of battle. Okay? So it's making it clear. So the Lord enters the battle, okay, not as someone looking to make peace, not as someone to hold their hand, not as someone to plead for them to believe the gospel. He enters the battle as a warrior king. He enters the battle as one to fight. And so he comes to Israel in the hour of her greatest need. That's why we sang that song tonight. He is the Lord of angel armies. Yes, okay. The Lord of hosts. I love that too. Exodus 15 calls him a warrior. Isaiah 42 calls him a man of war. And so all these nations are concentrated against Israel, but now there is the coming of the Lord. Verse 4. In that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley. And so that half of the mountain will move toward the north and the other half toward the south. Where will Jesus return? Okay. There's a cult in America that says Jesus is going to return to Utah. Okay. I said there's a cult in America that says Jesus will return to Utah. That's not where he's returning to. Okay. He returns to the Mount of Olives. If you remember in Acts 1, okay, Acts 1:11, angels say, hey, Jesus is going to return the same way he left. Where did he leave from? Mount of Olives. Okay. So he leaves from the Mount of Olives. He's going to return to the Mount of Olives. But he comes in a much different way this time. He doesn't come as a baby in a manger. He doesn't come meek and mild. He comes, and when his foot hits the Mount of Olives, it splits. It wrecks it. Okay? And all over the Bible describe the Lord's coming as an earthquake. So it splits in its middle, it divides in half, and we're going to see here in a little bit, it really just kind of reshapes the whole landscape around Jerusalem. And when this valley is created, when the Lord returns, verse 5 says, you will flee by the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains will reach to Azel. Yes, you will flee just as you fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. Okay. The word Azel, its Hebrew means near, and many think it's a place kind of east of Jerusalem. So the valley splits, and God's people kind of flee down this valley, but near, not too far away. And this becomes not only a place of Israel's escape, but a place of judgment where God is going to judge the nations. And then it says, and so the Lord comes, and all of his holy ones with him. And so Revelation tells us that the Lord returns with his saints. And so there is the church, there is the New Testament church, but also sometimes the holy ones describes angels. And I'm not actually sure to what degree, like Old Testament saints are involved here. The Old Testament saints don't get their resurrected bodies until later. But could they still participate in this part? I kind of think so, but it's more of a feeling than a verse I can point to. But so here's God's people returning and surrounded by angels. And I thought I would read just from Revelation 19, kind of the same scene, but from a different perspective. This was the passage I read when I became a Christian, or that led me to Christ. Revelation 19:11, and I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and wages war. His eyes are a flame of fire, speaking of his righteous judgment, and on his head are many diadems or crowns, speaking of his authority and his sovereignty. He has a name written on him which no one knows except himself. He is clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies which are in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, were following him on white horses. You wonder where we fit in? That's us. Okay? From his mouth comes a sharp sword, so that with it he may strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. and he treads the winepress of the fierce wrath of God the Almighty. And on his robe and on his thigh he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Okay? When Jesus returns, the remnant is going to return to Christ, and that's what we read about in chapter 12. It's some of what we read about in chapter 13. This is a fantastic day. Okay? Verse 6, and in that day there will be no light. The luminaries will dwindle. Okay? And that seems like kind of a crazy thing to say, but when the Lord returns, Isaiah 24 talks about it, Joel 3 talks about it, Matthew 24 talks about stars fall from the heaven, the sky becomes black, the sun and the moon are extinguished. And so when the Lord returns, just like everything is going to flip upside down, everything is going to change. And there's light, but the light that we see is from the glory of Christ. Okay? It's not from suns and moons. So it's replaced by the light of Christ's glory. Verse 7, for it will be a unique day, which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but it will come about that at evening time there will be light. What? Okay. So normally when it's dark, that's when it's going to be light. Okay. Everything is shook up when the Lord returns. It changes quite literally everything. Verse 8, and in that day living waters will flow out of Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea and the other half toward the western sea. It will be in summer as well as in winter. What Israel was used to was streams that they had for some part of the year but dried up during the dry months. And what the Lord is promising here is there's going to come a day where just rivers of bubbling, living, flowing water run out of Israel, and they don't dry up during any season. It's just life-giving water all the time. And so I think this area that's talking about Jerusalem, right in the middle of Jerusalem is Mount Moriah. That's where the temple is. And I think right from there, the ground will crack open and streams of water are going to flow out. And some people say, well, this is just kind of a euphemism for blessing. Blessing is going to flow from Jerusalem. And I think that's true, too. Blessing will definitely flow from Jerusalem. But Ezekiel 47 describes the same idea of life-giving streams that gush out of the sanctuary. Jerusalem is going to become kind of the center of the world. And one of the things why I think it's real water is Isaiah 35 talks about the desert around Jerusalem is going to bloom like the rose. Why? Because God is just blessing it. It's just flowing with water and with life. Okay? So we saw these nations come against Israel. We see the coming of the day of the Lord. Verse 9, we see the crowning of the king. And the Lord will be king over how much of the earth? Some of it? A little bit? Some areas just kind of outside of town? All of the earth. In that day, the Lord will be the only one, and his name the only one. And doesn't it just kind of touch your heart? And I mean, how many times do you see people talking on the news and it's just a completely godless way of viewing the world? Or people talk about some kind of just godless pagan religion. It just kind of breaks your heart that people are deceived and people are promoting things that are untrue, or the name of your Lord is besmirched. Yeah. King of the world, and that's exactly right. The Lord is not only King of heaven, he is King of earth, and this is when we see it become a reality. The King is coming, is going to be King. There's a lot of religions in the world. You know how many religions there are in the kingdom? One. Okay. There's one religion in the kingdom. There's one object of worship in the kingdom. There's one king in the kingdom. The Lord will be the only one, and his name the only one. All the systems of Satan are over. All the doctrines of demons are finished. And the Lord reigns, and the Lord is worshipped. Verse 10. All the land will be changed into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem will rise and remain on its site from Benjamin's gate, as far as the place of the first gate to the corner gate, from the tower of Hananel to the king's wine presses. Say, wow, Eric, what a blessing. And if you thought what I thought when I first read that, I'm like, what does this mean? Okay. And so I just have a lot of help. So I'm reading what commentaries say about this, and I think John MacArthur was super helpful when he described this. And so when the Lord comes, there is this tremendous earthquake that takes place, right? And it splits the Mount of Olives. But one of the things that happens is it says all the land will be changed into a plain. And he describes from Geba to Rimmon, so it's like from the very far north all the way down south. And so all of this area is changed into a plain. The word for plain there, and even some, I think maybe the King James leaves it, is Araba. And Araba is not just any plain, but the deepest plain. There's this deep valley that goes from the Dead Sea all the way south down through Galilee, but at it's the deepest valley in the earth. And some portions of it are 1,300 feet below sea level. And so what's he saying? He's saying all this terrain around Israel is in some way going to be flattened. And Israel will stand kind of proud in the middle of it. Kind of the way like a diamond sets on a ring. And so here is Jerusalem, the center of the world that the Lord has always promised Israel that it would be. And now it rises up above all else, and everything else is smoothed and flattened around it. And he's going to rebuild the city, and it talks about, from Benjamin's gate here to this place there. And just the idea is Jerusalem is going to be expanded to its kind, and Israel to its original boundaries, not to kind of the small area in Zachariah's day, but eventually it's going to be expanded to the full area that God had always promised. And so this is a great promise to Israel to see their city exalted. And it's also exalted because that's where the Lord's throne is going to be. The Lord is going to rule the world from Jerusalem. Verse 11, people will live in it, and there will no longer be a curse, for Jerusalem will dwell in safety. Okay? Jerusalem has been a place of fighting and squabbles over the land ever since they entered it. That's still the case today. Israel is at war today because of fights over pieces of land. He says, but there's going to come a time where there won't be any more curse. There won't be any more sin or idolatry there. It's going to become a place not just of righteousness and peace and safety, but of permanent righteousness, permanent peace, permanent safety. Okay? And then what happens to so many of the Old Testament prophets they understand that anytime you talk about a righteous place and the worship of the Lord, and the question is always, but what about those that oppose that? Okay, what about Israel's enemies? What about all the nations around Israel with false gods and false beliefs and those that persecute God's people? And so many of the prophets, every time they talk about the exaltation of the worship of the Lord, they'll also talk about the conquest of the Lord's enemies. Verse 12. Now this will be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples who have gone to war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they stand on their feet, and their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongue will rot in their mouth. It will come about in that day that a great panic from the Lord will fall on them, and they will seize one another's hand and the hand of of one will be lifted against the hand of another. Judah will also fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations will be gathered, gold and silver, garments of great abundance. So also like this plague will be the plague on the horses and the mules, the camel, the donkey, and all the cattle that will be in those camps. Okay? So Zechariah kind of reviews this judgment that takes place at Armageddon, right before the Lord returns. And maybe even after, as he's meting out judgment on the nations. But God is going to strike all these kind of heathen forces. And the main idea is God is the author of life, right? Who gives life? The Lord does. That same Lord that gives life can remove life whenever he chooses. Okay? And people don't realize that their lives just hang by a thread their entire life. They take for granted the life that they have, and the Lord can remove life as easily as he can make it, anytime he pleases. And here it just says, it's just like it's people, why they stand on their feet, they dissolve. Has anybody seen Indiana Jones in the Last Crusade? I'm reaching here, but this is really good. I couldn't help it. Okay, so there's a point where they get the cup, right, the Holy Grail, and one guy drinks it, and he chooses poorly. And what happens? The guy just disintegrates, and that's when I read this. That's just where my mind goes. That in that special effects, just his eyes melt out of his skull, and he just dissolves, and he just dies in an instant, in a moment. And so God withdraws life, and so many of those that oppose him just die. And then it's interesting that it says Judah will also fight at Jerusalem. So God's going to empower his people to kind of have supernatural strength, even though God doesn't need any help. He enables them. And also it says that all of this world's kind of wealth sort of returns to Jerusalem, which is pretty interesting. The wealth of all the nations is brought back to the hands of God's people. Okay? Ultimately, all the wealth of the world returns to who it really belongs to, who it's always belonged to the Lord. Okay? And that's promise. And then finally, the character of the kingdom. So all the ungodly are judged. Christ is on the throne. The land is flattened. Jerusalem is exalted. Jesus is reigning on the throne. The remnant is ready to receive the kingdom that's been promised. What happens? Verse 16. Then it will come about that any who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the kingdom, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Booths. Okay? God comes down, and again, his glory is tabernacled amongst his people again, and so they celebrate this feast again. I think in the kingdom there's a whole lot of Old Testament feasts that some people think are gone, but they return. But they don't return in the same way. They return because now, when God's people celebrate these feasts and these different times of prayer, they have a clear understanding of who it is. They're not just looking vaguely ahead, kind of in shadows, to a Messiah that they don't know his name. Now we celebrate these things next to the Messiah that redeemed us and saved us, and so it's with knowledge. And so the kingdom is a place of worship. It's a place of feasts that happen, and worship of the King and celebration. But also, verse 17, and it will be that whichever the families of the earth does not go to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. If the family of Egypt does not go up or enter, then no rain will fall on them. It will be the plague with which the Lord smites the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. This will be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. Okay? If nations don't come, if nation rebels, God is going to turn off rain. Okay? If that's not enough, God will allow plagues. When God sets up his kingdom, okay, he doesn't allow rivals and he doesn't allow disobedience. It's going to allow for worship and celebration of the only one who deserves to be celebrated and worship of the only one who should be worshipped. And that's not optional. Okay? That's a good thing, and we look forward to that. But this also helps clue us in that the kingdom isn't the eternal state either. Okay? And so mortals enter the kingdom, and so there are people with sin natures that even though Satan is gone, still make sinful choices, still choose to worship sin and self rather than the Savior. So that helps us. Some people conflate the kingdom with the eternal state, and if you do that, if all the verses about the kingdom become eternity, then what do you do with stuff like this, that people that won't come and worship? Okay? What do you do with that the Lord needs to rule with a rod of iron against people that want to rebel? What do you do with passages that talk about those that die, and if they die at 100 years old, it'll be like dying as an infant? So there's still, everything isn't as it ultimately will be in the kingdom. Verse 20. In that day there will be inscribed, I love this, there will be inscribed on the bells of the horses, holy to the Lord. Okay? If you remember when it describes the garments of the high priest, Aaron the high priest would wear a turban, and on that turban was like a gold plaque, and what the gold plaque said was holy to the Lord. Okay? Why? He was the high priest. And as he interacted for the people, okay, he needed to be holy, ritually holy, holy in the garments that he wore, holy in the way that he approached the temple and the Holy of Holies. And no one was like the high priest. He was completely unique. No one did what the high priest did. And holiness was the point, to be separate, to be different, to be completely dedicated to the Lord. Okay? Now, that was the high priest. Now, this says, like bells on a horse's bridle, say holy to the Lord. What's the point? In our world, okay, in Old Testament Israel, like the holiest thing we could imagine and see would be the high priest, this one guy, once in a while. And what this passage says is the most common stuff in the kingdom is holy. Like from horses' bridles to kitchenware, everything cries out holy to the Lord. Okay? And the cooking pots in the Lord's house will be like the bowls before the altar. Okay? Your pots and pans are like the holy instruments in the tabernacle. Why? It's not because the tabernacle is any less holy. It's because everything else is now holy. Okay? 21. Every cooking pot in Jerusalem and in Judah will be holy to the Lord of hosts. And all who sacrifice will come and take of them and boil in them. And there will no longer be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts in that day. Okay? Everything that exists is going to be set apart for the Lord's use. Everything is to be holy for the Lord. And if you wonder, like, what does God have against Canaanites? Canaanite is just kind of a figure of speech that refers to the morally and spiritually unclean person. So there won't be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord. Okay, all these places that serve the Lord, there won't be unholy people there. This is a holy kingdom. The Lord wants His people to be holy. The Lord wants His church to be holy. And so that's where we finish this grand vision of the kingdom, where those that concentrate against Israel are defeated. The Lord is crowned as king. The conquest of the nations and this place that is holy and a place of worship and a place of celebration. And I just thought I'd end with this, and hopefully you see it all the way through. The theme of Zachariah is Christ. Okay, I've loved studying this book because it's just so filled with Jesus. And so in chapter 1, Jesus is the man among the myrtles. Okay, he is the one riding for Israel on a battle horse. In chapter 2, he is the measuring one, measuring out the area that he's setting aside for his people. Chapter 3, he is the cleansing one. Chapter 4, he is the empowering one. Chapter 5, he is the judging one. Chapter 6, he is the crowned one. Chapter 7, he's the rebuking one. Chapter 8, he's the restoring one. Chapter 9, he's the kingly one. Chapter 10, he's the blessing one. Chapter 11, he was the shepherding one. Chapter 12, he's the returning one. Chapter 13, he is the smitten one. And chapter 14, he is the reigning one. And so Zachariah got to see Christ. And I hope that we did too in this book, that we got to see Christ for who he is and what he does. Maybe any questions, comments, thoughts? Jake, would you grab me that bottle of lemonade there on the window before my throat dries up and blows away? Thank you, bud. Yes, ma'am.
Do the Jewish people think he is the Messiah or not?
I mean, he presents himself that way. And at the very least, they think of him as one who's going to bring peace and safety. I've always taken it to mean that, yeah, they do see him as kind of their promised Messiah because they trust in him, because they make a covenant with him. So that's the way it seems to me.
Because Jaffa, when I was talking to her, she said that because what's going on over there now, that the Jewish people are expecting the Messiah very soon. And I said, yeah, we Christians also look for him to come back very soon too.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Yeah. Except for those kind of fake first.
Okay. Thank you, because I was wondering about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's cool how they included the two witnesses too.
Mm-hmm.
It's really neat.
Yeah. Yeah. Back in the olive tree.
Well, just right here, didn't they? Because it said there's no rain, and was that like not the same as the witnesses? This is the same kind of place.
This is so the two witnesses that withhold rain is during the tribulation.
Oh, that's right.
During the kingdom age, during the millennial kingdom, the 1,000 years, rain will be withheld if there's nations that rebel and choose not to worship the Lord.
Maybe Moses and Elijah are back again. Right?
Yeah.
Very well
it
could
seems
be.
to say the Lord does it,
Yeah.
Gene?
So if 1,000-year reign and his people are here, and there's nobody in heaven for 1,000 years, all the Christians, like famous people like Paul and people like that, we're all here on earth at that time?
Depends what you mean by heaven, Gene.
Where Jesus is, I guess, is heaven. But he's going to prepare a place for us.
Right, and it comes down. Heaven is where God is. Okay. And Revelation describes a new Jerusalem that comes down. So
gotcha.
But
after that 1,000 years, then where do we all go?
a new heaven and a new earth.
Is that already prepared? I think
So one of the things that happens to kind of kick off eternity is people look at it two different ways. It talks about elements burn with a fervent heat. Everything melts. And there's like, well, is everything incinerated and God recreates it? Or is everything purified, and God renews it? I don't care. As long as I'm there, I'm happy. Okay? But after the kingdom, Satan is released. There is one final rebellion. There is, a final judgment, a great white throne judgment. And those people that are his, then they enter eternity into a new heaven and a new earth that he's prepared or renewed or renovated. And his people go on to eternal blessing. Those that have hated him go on to eternal death.
Thank you.
Anyone else? So next week, Sermon on the Mount. So I did, Jessalyn Ortiz texted me before church and said that her mom, Marlene, isn't doing very well. She kind of hadn't been hardly eating anyway, and now she wasn't, I don't think, eating or drinking at all. And they said she really deteriorated rapidly. So pray for their family, pray for Marlene, pray for all their kids as they deal with that. Okay. And then Kelly's not here tonight. She's not feeling the greatest. We pray for her. I appreciate it.